Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 852, and today is November 10th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot I want to talk about on today's show, so just make sure you're sharing the show. I've mixed up the format a little bit recently, and I've gotten positive feedback from some viewers, and also the numbers on the show are up. So if you're enjoying what's happening here, share it out, get it out there to a few more feeds, and maybe some other people will become fans of what we're doing here. So starting off this story from last week, Senate votes down resolution to block Trump from starting war with Venezuela. Dave DeCamp wrote this on November 6th for antiwar.com. The legislation was proposed by Rand Paul, Adam Schiff, and Tim Kaine, so Republicans and two Democrats, and it was voted down 49 to 51. Ultimately, just Paul and Lisa Murkowski supported the bill. And so this came after, and I do believe we covered this on Thursday's show, that Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth went and talked to select members of Congress, probably about a dozen in total. It was the heads of the House and Senate, Foreign Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Forces committees, as well as the leadership of both chambers of Congress. So that's going to be Thune, Schumer, Jeffries, and Johnson, right? So that's going to be what, 10, 14, 16 maybe members of the House and Senate in total actually attending and getting this briefing. That's not very many people. And the reason they do this is because they know how this is going to work. The people who reach that level of the Congress do so because they believe what the Pentagon says. They believe what the National Security Advisor says, what the Secretary of State says. And so when Hegseth and Rubio go to Congress and they tell Schumer, Thune, and others, and really I think this was particularly directed at the Republicans. They do have a majority. They were able to lose 2 votes and still get this thing to pass. And so their Politico last week reported there were 4 Republicans who were thinking of voting for Rand's amendment, and they would have need our legislation here, and they would have needed 2 of those votes. And so really the goal was to make sure that those 4 senators didn't vote for Rand's resolution that would have constrained what the president could do in Venezuela. And it appears to have worked, right? Even though Schumer left saying that, oh, they didn't give us a lot of information, and there's been no reporting suggesting that the Trump administration really provided new information or better information about the strikes they were conducting in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Pacific, what their legal justification for that was, and ultimately if they conduct land strikes in Venezuela and target the Maduro government, exactly what the legal justification for that will be. So it seems to basically have been like a big show to give the House and Senate leadership the ability to tell their other members, oh, you know, they told me, I mean, I can't tell you, but they told me in this classified briefing that, you know, all those things that you're concerned about, you really don't need to be concerned about. That's what's happening here. That's what the vote was. And one of the unfortunate things about this vote is the Trump administration doesn't have any constitutional or legal standing to carry out these strikes, to wage this war against the Venezuelan government if they do expand it that far. However, now they're going to say, well, Congress voted and they voted to allow us to do this. They said that didn't apply by the war power. So in a very twisted way, this is going to be used as a pro-war argument, even though this was a vote that nearly would have constrained the president's military action. So this article here, North Korea tests missile, threatens offensive action against the U.S. I wrote this one for the Institute on November 9th. So I guess a couple important developments here. North Korea over the past, I want to say 3 weeks, has conducted 3 different test firings. One was a cruise missile. I think they said land to sea cruise missile. And then there were some short range ballistic missiles fired and also an artillery drill. And the first missile test came as Trump was preparing to go on his tour of Asia. The second missile test was during Trump's tour of Asia and just before he arrived in South Korea. And I believe the artillery fire was after Trump left, but as Hegseth, Secretary of War Hegseth, was still in South Korea and meeting with South Korean leadership, praising the development of the South Korean relationship and also visiting the demilitarized zone, the North Korean border. Certainly we've seen kind of an interesting strategy play out by the North Koreans since Trump took office, where it seemed at first they were just kind of happy being quiet. And then they conducted a couple missile tests, which usually signals that North Korea is looking for diplomacy. But that diplomacy never materialized. And then North Korea engaged in a 5-month hiatus from May until October, didn't test a single weapon. And it was really kind of unclear what, North Korea was doing during that time. They did put out a few, I think, very important statements over the summer where they said, one, we're no longer willing to engage with the South Koreans. It's absolutely pointless. The world empire lies in America. The South Koreans are proxy of the Americans. And so if we're going to engage, we're going to engage directly with the Americans. And two, they're only willing to engage with the Americans if Trump takes denuclearization off the table, to say that we're going to make a deal to, even if not normalize, improve the U.S.-North Korean relationship, reduce the military hostilities in the Western Pacific there, in East Asia, without demanding that North Korea give up its nuclear weapons, right? We're going to give them a reason to feel they don't need to have nuclear weapons, but we're not actually going to demand they give up their nuclear weapons. And the Americans have said, Marco Rubio has said, the U.S. isn't willing to take that position. My guess is that maybe North Korea was trying to get some direct engagement with Trump here and see if the president maybe had something different to say. That's often what happens when you have any breaking of establishment foreign policy in Washington. It's because Donald Trump engaged on the issue directly rather than it goes through the typical diplomatic channels, because then it has to go through Rubio, who ultimately doesn't want to deal with North Korea and wants to just continue to have Washington's maximalist demands. And so then most recently we have the USS, I believe the George Washington aircraft carrier, that is arriving in South Korea and is going to conduct some joint drills with the South Korean military. In response to that, I think it's the head of the North Korean Defense Ministry who said that North Korea is looking at offensive action against the U.S. I do think this is empty rhetoric, that they're not going to just attack the U.S. anytime soon. However, it is notable that they're saying it. And again, I think the fiery rhetoric and literally firing of missiles is likely a effort by North Korea to get on Trump's radar to engage in discussions. And as we transfer to our next subject, which is the war in Ukraine, I also think it's worth noting here that North Korea has continued to step up their ties, regular meeting with Russian ministers all over, civilian, military, upper level meetings with Lavrov and the North Korean foreign minister. So that relationship is continuing to develop, and I think makes North Korea more and more comfortable to draw a hardline position on its talks with the U.S. because they know they have another outlet that they don't need to normalize with the West. In fact, at this point, it's the U.S. that would benefit from decreasing tensions with North Korea and then opening up the North Korean economy to the West. All right, moving right along here, Russia is looking at taking a key city in the Donbass. I wrote this one for the Institute on November 6th. So this is Pulvrovsk, And this is one of the last remaining key cities that Russia doesn't hold in the Donbass. Once they take this city, a lot of the remaining territory in the Donbass outside of Russia's control is going to be kind of open, flat farmland, and it will be very hard for the Ukrainians to defend from Russian air power. So this is looks to be kind of a major gain, right? A lot of people like to say, oh, Russia is only taking a couple kilometers of Ukrainian territory a day. And that is true, but that understanding also misses the kind of dynamics of war and how it works, where you may work for weeks or months or even years to take a small city or a small chunk of kind of strategically fortified geographic territory, right? Whether it be an island, highlands, anything like that, that would make that particular area difficult to take. But once you take that, then the enemy has to fall back, dozens, hundreds of kilometers to their next defensive lines, and it gives you the opportunity to take a large swath of territory at a time. And so if people look at battle maps that are drastically changing, oftentimes these are dated in months, years, even decades, to have major changes in territory. It doesn't happen overnight a lot of times. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russian offensive isn't slow going. There were analysts predicting in December that this city would fall to the Russians, and the Ukrainians have done this time and time again, where they've been able to hang on of Mariupol. There was another city in the Donbass, the name escapes me right now, where they were able to hold on to that city for a long period of time, even when, Russia had started to cut supply lines and had that city mostly encircled. Now, there's probably two dynamics at play here, right? One is, I think Russia's strategy is to move slow, minimal cost, minimal risk to their own soldiers, in order to grind down the Ukrainian defenses. And so this war for Russia at this point in time is not about taking territory. It's about getting the Ukrainians to the negotiating table to agree to the deal that Russia wants. Now, this strategy has come at, I think, enormous cost to Russia, where maybe you could argue that they would have lost more troops, more military equipment on the battlefield. This strategy has allowed Ukraine to carry out a lot of asymmetric attacks inside of Russia, drone strikes against refineries and things like this, that probably have done real damage to the Russian economy and infrastructure. And there are large costs there, some civilian deaths, not a ton, but some civilian deaths caused by that. And I think you have to look at this policy of kind of moving slow and being willing to allow this war to take 4, 5, 10 years, but eventually being able to, if not dictate terms to Ukraine, have the Russian minimums as the absolute baseline for the negotiations. And from there, only talk about what else does Russia get, what else does Ukraine have to give up to end this war. So, there's a lot here, I think, to talk about and look at. Once Russia takes this city, I think we're going to find out that Ukraine probably overcommitted to their defense of this city and lost an unnecessary number of troops, well past the time it was strategically viable to continue to hold on to this city. They're going to continue to do so. And, we've seen the Ukrainians do that time and time again, and it has slowed the Russian advance, right? Like it has had some positive effects for the Ukrainians, but it has come at a, massive toll. All right, this one here, government shutdown delays weapons transfers to Ukraine. And so this is interesting. It was in Axios, and it just kind of shows the ineptitude of the U.S. government, where some State Department employees who have been furloughed because they're non-essential, deemed non-essential by the government, were involved in making sure Congress got the reports that said, the U.S. is shipping these arms to this country on this day. These arms are going to do this, that, and the other thing. And this is how it benefits U.S. national security. I'm sure 90% of this, they're just copying and pasting. There's no actual real thought that goes into this. Congress doesn't sit there and look at the reports and say, does sending Black Hawk helicopters to whatever country in Central Asia really benefit U.S. foreign policy? Or do they look at that report and they say, hey, cool, my donor Lockheed Martin is getting, $1 billion from this sale to a country that I couldn't find on a map, right? Like, this isn't really important to anything. These reports are anything like that, but they are being held up by the government shutdown, and that is apparently stifling some arms transfers to Ukraine. According to Axios, the process here is kind of interesting, so I just want to take a second to talk about it. That these weapons are not going directly from the U.S. to Ukraine. They're going to Denmark, Croatia, and Poland. There are HIMARS and AMR-AAM missiles. I think the AMR-AAMs are missiles that are fired from the F-16s, and I believe they're using them for interceptions at this point in time. And then, of course, the HIMARS, the longer range missiles or longer range rockets, I think 50 to 100 miles or so, that the U.S. has given to Ukraine, and also our allies have transferred them. So I'm guessing one of two things are happening here. Either these missiles are basically just a stopping point in the country, we deliver them to Poland, and then NATO transfers them to Ukraine, or we deliver these missiles to Poland. Poland sends either some Soviet-era missiles or older variant of the HIMARS to Ukraine, and that's what they actually use in Poland, and Croatia are keeping the newer weapons. Last story up here today I do think is important. Zelensky vows to prevent Russian oil exports to Hungary. Now, this has been caught by Ted Snyder. Almost no one else has discussed this. Really important. It looks like near the end of October, I think the date Ted identified was October 20th, there were 2 explosions at refineries, same day in Romania and Hungary. And both of those refineries processed Russian energy. And so as much as we have sanctioned and cut off the Russian economy, there are some Eastern European countries that are still importing Russian energy. Hungary has basically said that if they don't get this energy at the price they get it from Russia, the country is economically in ruins, that they just simply can't operate their economy on a higher price of energy, that their people will be miserable, cold, broke, unable to cook their food. Absolute catastrophe in Hungary if this happens. And this has been a lingering issue between Hungary and Ukraine that I've discussed throughout the war in Ukraine, where Ukraine has targeted the pipelines that are bringing the Russian energy into Hungary, into Romania, and it's really upset the Hungarians. They've said, hey, stop doing that. And the Ukrainian officials have said, no, we're going to keep doing it. You're wrong for buying the Russian oil still. So we have Viktor Orban, who seems to have a positive relationship with Donald Trump. And I'm never really sure why. It must be a personality thing, because Orban is kind of getting in the way of what Trump wants to do on Russia when it comes to ramping up the sanctions pressure. Orban doesn't want to agree to more sanctions on Russia, and this has held up a lot of European sanctions from going to Russia. Orban has also stood against the blot selling more weapons, giving more money to the Ukrainians, and that's how Trump wants to see this war progress, with more European money, more European pressure on Russia. But Orban goes to the U.S. and actually gets Trump to agree to an exemption for Hungary from U.S. sanctions on Russia's oil industry. Now, Hungary, Orban and the foreign ministry presented this agreement as being unending, right? Like it's maybe not permanent, but I think they used indefinite, where the White House has said that it's temporary. So there do seem to be some differences there. But after this, Zelensky says he vows to prevent Russian oil exports from reaching Hungary. And this could be a major issue for the Ukrainians. Now, as easy as it is to think that all of these European leaders who have invested so much in the war in Ukraine are going to be unlikely to allow Budapest to ruin that for them, if it is found out that Ukraine has already or continues to conduct attacks on European energy infrastructure. I mean, the Germans have accused them of blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. I put a question mark behind that. And then, of course, you have the Ted Snyder's great reporting on the explosions in Hungary and Romania. And Zelensky certainly sounds like he's adding to that thread, saying that we are going to continue with this policy. And when Hungary is going to the European Union and saying, I'm not going to agree to more sanctions because I want cheaper Russian energy, it probably doesn't resonate very well with the rest of the bloc. Even if I completely agree with the Hungarian nationalism, I think Hungary should do what's best for Hungary, not what's best for Ukraine in the greater European bloc or NATO or anything like that. But I do think it's probably a somewhat ineffective argument to make at the European Union, and it's almost more likely that the European Union would abandon Hungary before they abandon Ukraine, if that's the debate being held. But if the Hungarians and the Romanians are going to the European Union and saying, we have evidence that the Ukrainians attacked our energy infrastructure, and the Germans have already indicted Ukrainians for attacking their energy infrastructure, then that side is making a really powerful case. And I think it's possible that the Ukrainians really don't understand how far they might overstep here if they do push forward with more attacks on these pipelines or Hungarian energy infrastructure. All right, so this one here, this is kind of an interesting story. Israel expands open fire policy along Egyptian border. And so Israel Defense Minister Israel Katz says that the Israel-Egyptian border is now a closed military zone, and the IDF has permission to fire on any person who enters that area. And they're warning about international arms smuggling into southern Israel from Egypt. Now, this is interesting for a few reasons. They say this is about the war in Gaza. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. But the Shin Bet and the Israeli people within the IDF have pushed back against Katz's order, saying that what's happening is there are drones that are flying 10, 15, 20 kilogram loads over the border from Egypt into southern Israel, and then the contraband is being retrieved by Israelis. And so they're warning that Katz's order isn't going to kill Egyptians, it's not going to kill Palestinians, it's going to kill Israeli citizens, and I'm guessing by the level of alarm that they had, Jewish citizens of Israel, not Palestinian citizens of Israel. So that raises some questions about who is getting these arms, right? That, like, who are these weapons actually going to? Why is the Israeli government concerned about these arms? And then also just the kind of interesting discrepancy between the Israeli government and military, where the military doesn't want to fire on Israeli citizens, and it seems that the minister is a authorizing it. So this is November 6th, JudgeNap.com. Kazakhstan expected to join Abraham Accords. They did announce this. The details unclear of what the hell is happening here. Kazakhstan already has relations with Israel, so this seems like a big nothing to me. The Trump administration is maybe trying to reunite the Abraham Accords. They are working on a deal between Syria and Israel. I don't think that is going to be a Abraham Accords normalization style agreement, but rather a ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal agreement that's going to resemble the deals Tel Aviv has made with Hezbollah and Hamas, which of course has just allowed Israel to continue to pummel those areas, as we'll get to in a second here. And also the U.S. is going to deploy troops to the Damascus airport to monitor that agreement. Certainly worry about the safety of those U.S. troops being in a literal jihadist Al-Qaeda beehive there. All right, next up, Israel continues to kill Palestinians as Hamas returns bodies of hostages. So Hamas has now returned the bodies of, I believe, 23 of 28 of the hostages, and all 20 living hostages. So they've actually returned more bodies than I anticipated they would be able to, certainly this quickly, but just overall, the fact that after all this destruction, Palestinians say that they can't even find their homes. Like the area, the landscape is so utterly flattened, they don't know the area where their home once stood, so they could pitch a tent there and start rebuilding. That they've been able to go through and recover all these bodies is fairly impressive. They recovered most of them without the heavy demolitions clearing equipment that Egypt brought in. So, that somewhat impressive. I wonder if they are going to be able to find and locate all 28 and what that would mean for the ceasefire agreement if they were able to do so. I had kind of anticipated, and I almost think the Israelis did too, that Hamas would never be able to return this many or all of the captives. And because of that, they would have an excuse to break the ceasefire, to not allow it to progress. Oh, well, Hamas is still holding on to some of our hostages. They know where they are. They just won't tell us. I think was going to be Israel's argument. And so that may fall flat and may help the ceasefire to at least continue to linger on. The other thing here is that Israel continues to violate the ceasefire in many ways. So they're killing Palestinians every day. A journalist in central Gaza reported Israeli drone strikes hit civilians in Khan Yunis, and artillery fire continues to pound Gaza City. The ceasefire, there are supposed to be 600 aid trucks entering Gaza per day. The highest number I believe I found so far is 200 on a single day. The average is significantly lower than that. I think it is in the triple digits, so over 100 trucks entering Gaza a day, but still 600 was the number that international aid agencies said was needed in Gaza. This was at the start of the war, before nearly everyone was displaced, every hospital destroyed, everyone starved for months, everyone living in tents. They said 600 aid trucks were needed every single day, and far less than that is entered even under the ceasefire period. And it's not 600 or 200 trucks of food that are coming in either. There's mattresses, blankets, tents. I think one of the last days they allowed a lot of sanitary products in for women, which desperately needed, right? Like, this is really important. At the same time, just don't think that there's 200 semi trucks absolutely packed to the brim with food entering Gaza every day. That's not the situation. It seems like maybe half of those trucks are food. So the starvation crisis, the shortage crisis, the displacement crisis still going on. And while Israel has released about 2,000 Palestinians as a part of the prisoner exchange, they already arrested about 450 Palestinians in October. So certainly not leaving those jails empty or partially less full for long. Last story up here today. Ansar Allah threatens to resume attacks on Israel if Gaza ceasefire breaks down. And so I just wanted to note that the Houthis, Ansar Allah, are threatening to go back to war with Israel. And the leader of the Houthi movement, I think his name is Abdullah Malik al-Houthi, is saying that, look, this was beneficial for us, this overall war. We strengthened ourselves during it. Sure, the U.S. and Israel bombed Yemen intensely a few times, but they have been the only power in the Middle East to not back down from Israel and to essentially kind of get to dictate terms a little bit. You know, they agreed to a ceasefire with the Americans that didn't include Israel. That was quite shocking to me. So the Houthis feel like they're in a position of strength, and they're threatening to resume attacks on Israel. We will see kind of how this develops, but I don't anticipate that the ceasefire is going to hold long term. Months, I thought, was the best estimate, in 10 weeks maybe, as similar to the one we saw earlier this year. And even if it does hold, it doesn't mean that Israel isn't going to continue to just carry out air strikes at a slower pace in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. All right, everybody, that will do for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Later today, Larry Johnson comes on the Kyle Anzalone show, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.